Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Strength and Hormones podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Papanos, and today I'm joined by Danny Sheriff, and we are going to be talking about how to use what's called fertility awareness method, or FAM, both for contraceptive and also fertility purposes. We'll be getting into some of the different ways that you can track your cycle, including things like basal body temperature tracking and cervical mucus changes, OPK kits, all of that good stuff that you might be familiar with. If what I'm saying sounds like totally a different language to you right now, by the end of this episode, you'll feel really comfortable with some of these acronyms and things that we're throwing at you. And you'll also hopefully feel confident if you wanted to switch to utilizing these as a cycle tracking method on how to do so for either of your goals, because they can be great tools for both a birth control as a contraceptive, as well as on the other end, if you are actually trying to conceive and for fertility mechanisms. So thank you so much for being here, Danny, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I'm very passionate, and it pleases me that so many other people are getting interested in it too.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of confusion, questions, and kind of like a baseline knowledge, familiarity by a lot of like consumers, individuals out there, but maybe not 100% confidence. And so I want to really empower women with the tools to feel more confident, because I agree that these can be really great tools. I've used them myself for years, use them with a lot of patients. So I feel like you'll do a really great job of being able to educate us as you're an expert in this area. So why don't you just give us a little bit of a brief introduction into who you are and some of your professional training around fertility awareness method?
Yeah, cool. So I am Danny Sheriff. I am the founder of the HA Society. So I, in particular, work with women who are missing their menstrual cycles due to hypothalamic amenorrhea. So, interestingly, it surprises people to know that we use the fertility awareness method with people who don't even have menstrual cycles as a way of helping them to return their cycle. So that's kind of what I do professionally. My background is in functional nutrition counseling, and I am a certified fertility awareness practitioner. Something that is important to note is that as a fertility awareness practitioner, I use and teach using this method as a diagnostic tool with clients to help improve cycles. But I am not technically certified to help someone use it as a contraceptive. So I like to throw that out there as it is an important nuance. Um, and while I can absolutely talk about it, and of course, I can use for the fertility awareness method as a contraceptive, and technically anyone I teach it to can. The space is very, very particular with who is allowed to say what they are and what they do. Because it's a very intensive multi-year training process to become a fertility awareness educator. But as a practitioner, using it as a diagnostic tool, I think this is something that any and all health practitioners working with women should have the skill set to do and be able to pass on the need to know information to other women. So we use it as a way to sort of identify if your fertility is optimal, look for areas where it is not, why maybe we're not getting pregnant, why maybe our menstrual cycle is not improving or returning.
And I think that's a good point too for women who maybe aren't menstruating. And I know that we have just some questions on some different scenarios, but I'm assuming even for maybe women who are like on birth control, maybe hoping to come off birth control, this can be a great tool as well for them,
Totally.
kind of just starting to understand things before they
Absolutely.
do decide to come off birth control.
Absolutely. Women coming off birth control, women maybe performing sports at a high level, trying to maintain training, women postpartum, women with PCOS, any and all issues, I truly believe there is utilization.
Yeah, amazing. So I think a lot of women are familiar with cycle tracking. I feel like a lot of women I work with, they are using a calendar method, which we can talk about
Mm.
where there is insufficiency with the data that that provides. But maybe they're not familiar with this term fertility awareness method, or FAM in general. So could you just start off by giving us a history and just an overview of what FAM is, and just more background in terms of how this came to be?
Yeah. So, in a nutshell, and originally, FAM was a natural planning method approach. That's what it is. It's a very Christian background. It involves the tracking and interpretation of physiological signs like our basal body temperature and our cervical mucus changes and our cervix position. And we look at those different metrics to identify if we're fertile or infertile, which phase of the cycle that we're in. So that's kind of its traditional use. No one person invented it. Many different researchers, came across this information in different ways. And as a result, there's actually a variety of different methods of the fertility awareness method. So it's actually it's got subcategories. There are mucus only methods, there are temperature only methods, and there are both symptothermal methods, and the list honestly can go on. So I prefer the Justice method. And basically, for the most part, it's researchers that came up with it and then came up with the method, created some of their own clinics and things like that. And it's riddled with rules and nuances, but once you get the hang of understanding all of those rules and nuances, you have just as good a chance at avoiding pregnancy or successfully timing for pregnancy as any other method out there, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that all the methods within fertility awareness method are non-hormonal, right? So it's nothing that someone's ingesting or taking as a supplement or pharmaceutical or any type of substance. It's all understanding your body's own changes to know where you are. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's the exact best piece of it, is that like you don't have to take anything exogenous. You're just observing your own signs, and it will blow your mind how clear and obvious it is for you to identify which window you're in.
Okay. And would you say that the calendar method of just tracking where your period starts is sufficient to include that in fertility awareness method, or do we need something that's a little bit more specific, I suppose, to our body's own cues than just the calendar method?
Absolutely, we need something more specific. Anyone who tells you, "Oh, I tried that fam thing, but that we got pregnant," I'm like, "No, you were doing something else. You were doing the calendar method." I hear these people be like, "I ovulate on the same day every month, and I get my period on the same day every month," and I'm just like, I low key don't believe you. That's just wild to me. It just couldn't possibly be true. It just couldn't possibly be true. But I mean, people welcome to go DM me and be like, "No, I swear." But I mean, not every day of the month has the same amount of days. So I think that we're ballparking it, and you can get pretty close. If you have a nice, healthy, consistent cycle, which is great. But if you're trying to avoid pregnancy, that's not gonna do the trick.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that, because I do think that that is a big misconception, and that a lot of people are like, I can feel it. I can tell when I'm ovulating, and that's exactly what this method is to some extent, but I do think we need a little bit more than just a feeling, right? We need some actual clear hard data if you really do want
Yeah,
to use it as like a tried and true method for both contraception and fertility.
exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned there's a couple of different tools within this, both checking like cervical mucus production or cervical position, as well as taking body temperature, basal body temperature. Is there any other types of methods that can be utilized outside of those two?
So mucus and basal body temperature are the two big hitters. Cervical position is there, and there are also some methods that have some additional tools that you can use. Test strips, you pee on them and you get various readings and plug into a fertility monitor. Generally, a pretty expensive way to go about doing things. People who do that are often in a conception journey and not so much just a general health or contraception situation. But that's where the science is. It's in mucus, temperature, and position.
Okay. And maybe let's just start with cervical mucus, because that might not be something that someone's even familiar with. Can you just introduce us to what cervical mucus is?
Yeah. It's by far and away the coolest thing ever. It truly is so amazing. And, I think growing up, a lot of us experienced discharge. We'll go to the bathroom and see discharge in our underwear, and we're like, oh, that's not good. like something's wrong. A lot of people went to the doctor, were like, this is happening. And the doctor said, here's the pill. But it's actually perfectly healthy. You should see and observe cervical mucus at a certain point every month. And this is what helps us truly realize that we're in the fertile window. So cervical mucus is being produced basically because we're gearing up for ovulation. Estrogen's reaching a certain point. Follicle development, maturation is reaching a certain point, and we're ready to ovulate within the next 3 to 5, maybe 7 days. And so we're going to start producing mucus because our body wants to try and get us pregnant. So if you have sex within the time frame that you are seeing cervical mucus, your chances of pregnancy are at their absolute highest. Cervical mucus is the perfect pH. It's the perfect environment to keep sperm alive for up to 5 days. So it's like, this is how people get pregnant accidentally, right? Is because that can survive in there. It's a very nourishing environment for sperm. And you'll notice mucus change over that period of time that you see it, from smaller amounts, white, creamy, to larger amounts, crystal clear, very stretchy. And basically what's happening under the microscope is it's going from a cozy net-like structure where it's keeping all of the sperm tucked in nice and comfortable, and keeping it fed and nourished, to a open channel like structure that is very easy for the sperm to swim through once the cervix opens, ovulation is happening, to go and meet the egg. So it's actually a very incredible process that's happening every single month. So when someone's trying to avoid conception, if you see mucus, you're going to want to back right away, right? But if you're trying to get pregnant, you're going to want to jump on that situation. So checking for mucus constantly is very important. But also, as you get more used to that whole process of observing and checking mucus, you start even feeling it. Like, there is a clear and obvious difference on your dry days when you go to the bathroom and you wipe your vulva and you feel like this is dry. And then when you go one day and you wipe and it's really quite smooth or even very slippery, or even you just feel it walking around and you're kind of like, like, what was that? Oh, I'm in my fertile window, right? So
Yeah.
with practice, it becomes really quite clear, but that is the role of mucus. And that is an extremely valuable, tangible piece of evidence to tell you right about where you are in your menstrual cycle. Once you do ovulate, it should dry up and you won't see any mucus in a healthy, optimal cycle.
Mhm. And in women that have something like hypothalamic amenorrhea where they're not menstruating or that are on birth control, do we see cervical mucus?
So, yes, sometimes, and often no. It's one of the signs for us about how far away they might be from recovery, which is why we use it as a tool. So, if we bring someone on, they're like, oh, I haven't seen cervical mucus in years, like it's dry as a desert in there. That's information for me about estrogen production and hormone activity. But as we're making changes and they're increasing food and they're resting and they're doing the protocols and following the instructions, and they're coming to me in our calls or sending me an email and they're like, I thought there was something when I wiped. Like, wow, okay, that's new information. What you're doing is working, right? You have hormonal activity. Sometimes we can get to a point where they're seeing a lot of mucus and they're seeing mucus every day for 4 weeks. And, that's obviously not ideal, but it's still information for us, combined with the other signs of, basal body temperature and things. Okay, we got closer, but maybe it's still not enough, right? So it's enough to elicit hormonal activity, but it's not enough to get us to ovulation. And so we're using those signs as like a communication between our body and, how we're going to answer what it's telling us. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really great insight to provide and is also just such a great like at home tool that someone can do in so many different situations, right? Wherever they are on the spectrum of their goals and hormonal levels too. So thanks for explaining that a little bit more. You also mentioned cervical positioning changing. And I think that's something that's a little bit less commonly, I
Mm.
guess, assessed for, right? But can be something assessed for. Can you tell us a little bit about what that positioning change looks like?
Yeah. And in our practice, we don't use it as much because everyone's so early on in their generally they haven't even menstruated in a really long time with us. And also, it's very subjective. How my cervix may feel and sit could be completely different to how your cervix feels and sits. So it's hard for us to talk about it as much. Cervical position checking really involves you inserting a nice clean finger into the opening and just look at checking for the cervix. Is it low? Is it high? Is it open? Is it closed? Feeling around. And this you cannot do from day one. It requires you consistently checking every day, probably for, I mean, minimum 1 month, right? Till you finally experience a genuine shift in what you're feeling. But doing it consistently for about 3 months or so is going to help you stop being like, oh, okay, this is what happens. This is what it's like when my body, is closer to ovulation, when my body has ovulated. And if you're using cervical mucus and if you're using basal body temperature to cross check what you are experiencing when you insert your finger and feel for the position of your cervix, it's you're going to start connecting the dots a lot more. But that one probably takes the most practice.
Yeah, I feel like it's something more done if you go to your OBGYN, right? Than something you probably want to do at home. But I think it's still great for someone to
Yeah.
understand because it can also change, it can also impact, I guess, like comfort and pain with intercourse and things of that sort as well, right? Because of that position.
Yeah, exactly. And to be clear too, because I think I might have spoken with some assumed knowledge, but yeah, as the throughout the month, the uterus is actually changing position, the cervix is changing position. So, um, which kind of makes sense when we experience things like cramps and stuff, like your organs are moving around as it prepares for, potential conception. It's in more of a ready position. And so it's changing. So you can physically feel that change on an
Yeah,
internal check. Yeah.
cool. Okay. And then you also mentioned basal body temperature being another measurement. And this is one of my favorites. It's a little bit, I mean, I
Same.
think pairing it with cervical mucus is also wonderful. But it's just such an easy thing to do, especially nowadays with some of the technology we have available. So, can you introduce us to what basal body temperature, or what commonly is referred to as BBT, what it is?
Yeah, so it is the checking of what your temperature is with a basic thermometer orally most of the time under your tongue to see what your baseline temperature is upon waking in the morning. So it does have to be upon waking in the morning. You can't get up out of bed and move around or take a drink of water. It has to be like boom, right when you wake up to see what your baseline basal body temperature is. And this gives us a lot of information about, of course, pre and post ovulatory. So there is a general range. So we'll talk Fahrenheit today. 97.45, 97.5 is kind of a typical place for a healthy follicular phase, right? To always be around, roughly give or take a few points of a decimal. But once you have ovulated, you will see a clear and obvious increase in that, which is pretty fascinating. The first time you really witness, like, wow, I have been 97.6 every day for 2.5 weeks. And now for 10 straight days, I've been above 98. It's like pretty cool to witness. And it's very black and white and it's very objective. Like, I, this is happening. When you ovulate and progesterone rises, your basal body temperature increases and you're now running hotter than you are in the follicular phase when estrogen is more dominant. So that when we look at it on a chart and we plot it out on a chart and we watch we watch the line spike up and stay elevated, we can absolutely without a doubt confirm that ovulation happened or that it didn't happen, So that's really the best kind of, it is, in my opinion, too, my favorite. It is like the best tool. If it was the only tool I could use, I would use that. But there are caveats to that. There are a lot of people that basal body temperature does not work for. Shift workers, new mums, people who are having extraordinarily awful sleep. And so then we'll default over to cervical mucus. But the two of them combined, you have absolute clarity about what is happening under the hood. Just one or the other, you have a little less clarity. But yeah, they're both great. And definitely there are different ways, right? So we're seeing a lot of femtech right now. We're seeing a lot of the temp drop around the arm, the Aura ring. I think the Apple Watch is taking temps now.
Yeah.
Um, There's all kinds. And really, you'll notice too when you look at their marketing, they're also not saying they can help you with contraception. It's very much like identify ovulation, like time for a pregnancy. But no one's touching contraception with any length of a pole. They're just not doing it. And that's because the study, the science, the research is really with orals. That's kind of what the science is based off. So when you use anything else other than an under the tongue oral temperature, most people are reading lower. So, I was saying before 97.5 is kind of where you should be, but there are going to be people using femtech and they're going to be thinking, oh, well, I'm only 97.1. And that's probably because you're using a temp drop or something, which is absolutely fine. Just as a diagnostic tool, it's hard. Like, I can't help you with your problems as much if you're experiencing negative symptoms or you have hypothalamic amenorrhea or you have PCOS, or we're trying to understand why you're struggling to get pregnant, even though you clearly are ovulating. I can't use that information as much to tell you what's happening with your metabolism, your thyroid, your estrogen, than I can if you use an oral temperature, because there is more research behind that. So
Wow.
that's definitely a downside to femtech, is there's slightly less information about how you're recovering, how you're resting, how you're feeling. And it's kind of purely, in my opinion, it's purely, did you ovulate, yes or no?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that it's kind of like heart rate tracking, right? Where, if you use like an Apple Watch to track your heart rate, it's further away from your heart. So it's not going to be as accurate, but it still gives us some insight into like, are you in a high heart rate zone? Are you in a moderate heart rate zone, right? So it's kind of
Yeah, yeah,
similar
yeah.
with some of these other measures. But yeah, I agree that the under the tongue or anal, I mean, it really is the most accurate, right? But who's going to do that for checking their body temperature?
I've had
So
one person do anal and I was
did you?
absolutely shocked. I
Wow,
was
that's a committed
absolutely shocked.
individual.
I know.
I love it. I love it. But yeah, I think what is under the tongue, I think is the second most like accurate way to assess body temperature. So
Yeah, like
that's
yeah, we'll go with that one for sure. I think it's the
yeah.
easiest.
The most, yeah, which still I think a lot of people, I notice that they struggle with like remembering because you have to do it first when you wake up, right? So it's like your brain is not even fully awake and it can be
Yeah,
hard to
yeah.
remember. So I don't know if you've found any tricks for that has been successful with any clients.
You do have to white knuckle through that first week, but once you're going, it becomes significantly easier and you almost get excited. And yeah, maybe a different alarm sound or something that just makes you kind of think like, oh, that's different. What's that?
Yeah, it's definitely just like creating any new habit, right? It just takes some time, but then once you do
Hmm.
it, you start to get into the groove of it. So I love that
Hmm.
idea though with the alarm clock.
Yeah.
So you mentioned too just how that temperature change is very indicative of the progesterone response. And I think a lot of women
Mm.
are surprised to learn that. They're like, "What? That's so cool." Like literally I just take my temperature and I can understand if I'm like making enough progesterone, if I'm making progesterone at all. So I'm really glad that you touched on that. And something that I want to also mention too that maybe you can expand on a little bit further is that in some women they ovulate, but maybe they're not getting a progesterone response for quite long enough, or that progesterone isn't staying quite elevated, right? And they're having what we call like a
Yeah.
luteal phase defect, where that progesterone is, coming up and then it's dropping back down and it's not quite staying high enough for at least 10, 14-day period that we're looking for. Do you find this happening in a lot of women that you work with when they're starting to recover their cycles or when they might be starting to deal with some like hormonal irregularities?
Hmm. Yeah, this is our number one problem to resolve. I'm sure you have a similar experience with, people that you've worked with in the past. It's just rampant in our culture. Like everyone's just walking around with low progesterone. Um, it's gotten to the point where I just work on it in advance. I don't even wait anymore with clients to see if when they recover will their progesterone be low. We just start taking action right away because it's just so common.
It really is quite a epidemic, if you will, right? In terms
Yeah.
of how common it is. And I think that so much of like the hustle culture and the high cortisol response that causes someone to lose their menstrual cycle in the first place is so much to blame for that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The everything about our lifestyle is not conducive to optimal progesterone production. And, even I struggled with this when I was trying to get pregnant. It took me 3 tries because while I had a menstrual cycle and I was kind of fitting within the regular parameters and was like, oh, I have an 11-day luteal phase, I wasn't getting pregnant, so it's not until you're getting pregnant that you're trying to conceive that you really, really know if this is okay or not. And I had to make some major changes. And the good thing was that as soon as I made those changes, the next cycle, I did get pregnant. I know my tendencies. I know my habits. I know my stresses. I know the ways that I push myself a little bit too hard. And dialing back on those things is just absolutely game changing for progesterone. There's a lot of things people can do that are quite low hanging fruit for it, which is kind of what's so frustrating because I have a bit of a belief in my mind that there's a lot of people out there getting fertility treatment who just have low progesterone.
I don't think it's a belief. I think it's a fact.
Yeah, it might be a fact. And I mean, you can't help but be a little bit like suspicious sometimes, like scrolling on Instagram, and I'll get some post of some fitness girl struggling with her fertility journey. And I'm like, oh, let me go in and see like what is her fertility journey.
Mhm.
And there's never a lot of information, but just like a lot of videos with like sadness next to their negative pregnancy tests. And while I know absolutely there are people with, you know, great looking menstrual cycle charts and conception's not happening for another reason, that's absolutely out there. Oh, I just know I'm like a lot of them. I'm like, just let me help you. Because I see you with your picture perfect vegan meals and your everyday working out and your extremely low body weight and you're like some online entrepreneur. And I'm just like, I think like until that's addressed, I don't know. I think that's your problem. And it's probably manifesting as low progesterone.
Yeah, of course, there can be so many other reasons for infertility and fertility challenges, but I think that that's very much the low progesterone is a very low hanging fruit that a lot of women are dealing with. And unfortunately, it's just not something that's talked about that is educated for women to understand enough. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we're having this conversation today, so that women can start to track these things and start to understand, like, am I having issues before it becomes a bigger problem. And so, hopefully this gets the word out more for women to be able to understand their body and those hormonal changes. And I think a lot of women too, they want to do what's easiest, what's most convenient, and checking cervical mucus, doing your basal body temperature every day maybe just doesn't feel realistic. It's not something ideal. And I think that once women understand the power of it, the more they're apt to do it,
Mm.
right? Because they realize, like, wow, this is really incredible in terms of the data it's giving me. But maybe you can just talk a little bit about, for those women who are still using things like LH test strips, or what are sometimes referred as like an OPK kit, an ovulation predictor kit. What are the shortcomings with that? Are there any? And do we feel like BBT and cervical mucus are a better tool than those others?
Yeah, I think LH strips, OPKs definitely have their place, especially if we have someone who has a chart that is very hard to read for one reason or another. Like it's an additional tool, but that's kind of where that stays for me. An LH peak for different people could be anywhere from like 25 to 40 MIU over ML. Like we all ovulate at slightly different amounts, but a test strip has only one amount. Like, it has a set range. So it's assuming that every woman is the same, but they're not. So I find myself in a lot of conversations with people overanalyzing their LH strips. Is this positive? Is this not? It said it was positive. I haven't ovulated yet. Like, what's going on? And we're always having to remember, like, the amount of LH you need to get a positive could be different to what the test says, or vice versa. So you might get a positive a little easier because the different brands have different ranges as well. They're not all the same. So it is, and some of them are like solving a little riddle. We're like solving riddles here. I don't got time to be like looking at your pictures of your strips and telling you if I think it's positive or not. When it's just check your basal body temperature and your mucus and like call it good. But yes, if you are maybe unable to check BBT, for example, like you just have crazy shift work, um, your just life isn't conducive to BBT, and you only have mucus, like maybe we'll throw it in as an additional data point, right? But always just remembering that there's caveats and they're harder to read and they're quite expensive. And I'm all about like, women are already on struggle street with the things that, we have to buy and pay for thanks to our very own anatomy. And this is just not something that I think we should have to be forking out every month to use. Um, it just seems wild, like where this is a naturally occurring process of the body and we can understand this. And we've just gotten really far away from our innate ability to observe these things. But, you know, there are no LH strips in nature. You don't need those things to know if you have a healthy menstrual cycle. Most people using them are really just trying to make sure they don't miss ovulation. Like, that's pretty, it's just like a little bit of an anxiety around missing ovulation. And I understand that. But if you can really get on top of identifying your cervical mucus, checking for your temperature and seeing when that shift happened, you have all the information you needed.
Totally. Yeah, and I think that a lot of times the timing can confuse women as well because the LH surge will happen before you ovulate, right? And
Mm.
so that can be sometimes confusing for women as well that they aren't ovulating when they get that positive LH response,
Mm.
right? Or in women like that have PCOS, they have already higher than average LH levels. And so they might get a positive LH test strip all 30 days out of the
True.
month, right? And so
Yeah.
there's probably other situations I'm not even getting to that you might even have more information on that they just don't work well for. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I think they cause people stress, they cost people money. You can never ever be certain. And that is interesting. A lot of people do think it confirms ovulation.
Hmm.
Um, but it does not. Yeah, it predicts ovulation. Predictor kit predicts ovulation, but it also cannot predict ovulation. So that
Yeah.
sucks too. That it's in the name. It can suggest maybe there's a really good chance that this is going to happen at some point within the next few days, um, and that's about all it's giving you.
Totally. Yeah. So
And it
it can
could
be a
like, and it
tool
could just
maybe.
go away. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely a tool if you need it. Because the other options are out of your toolbox.
sure. Okay. What is the accuracy of fertility awareness method for contraception? Can someone use it and feel confident that it can be just as accurate as an oral contraceptive?
Yeah, yeah. When you use it to the absolute, follow all the rules. Like you have to follow all the rules over 99%. Just like any other contraceptive. That's the thing, is that you have to follow the rules. And there's probably like 10 that like are really important for making it happen. So I personally don't find it very difficult, but there are others who may. So doing their research into whether or not they think they can handle that is going to be very important. But if you think you can, it's so easy. As long as you're open and willing to follow the rules of FAM, you will be successful.
Yeah, and I know that that might sound overwhelming that you have to be so accurate with the rules, but like you mentioned, I think it's really important to just state how easy it is once you get it down.
Yeah. And they're easy rules, don't get
Yeah.
me wrong. They're easy rules, but they're just there. And it is overwhelming. And yeah, it is overwhelming. And it is, as a result, really worth it to hire a practitioner or do a course and not just try to DIY the learning curve. Um, because you're gonna have questions. Like everyone has questions. And we have just found like every single client who's come through the door and worked with us has left with just a crazy understanding of what's going on and what to do next and how to solve their own problems when they come up in the future. Um, and every single one of them asked a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So I think that that's just really important to like invest in the time to learn it. And I am not an academic person. I do not enjoy learning new things. When I had to learn this, I was like, ugh, and I doubted even my ability to learn it. But here we are. So if I can, you can.
Yes, definitely. And maybe you can also just talk about the difference in terms of like understanding your own raw data versus using an algorithm that's telling you your data. Because I think that that's also something to touch
Mm.
on, right? Because women are using these apps and the app is telling them this is when you're fertile, is when you're not fertile. But maybe that's not actually the reality of what's going on.
For real. We actually have our own app that was built by an incredible developer that removed all, I was like, no algorithms are allowed. It's an app designed for practitioners, but people can use it to just chart. Um, the algorithms, I'm sure, are wonderful for people who have never had a problem with their menstrual cycle in their whole life, which is like 10%. And the rest of us are living real lives with actual changes day to day, month to month, year to year. And the algorithm is trying to learn our body, and it's only getting a ballpark. I I do not love it. A lot of my friends use these different apps. They're always sending me screenshots. What does this mean? And I'm like, I can't read this. I don't what is this? Like it's all over the place. It's um like averaging out their temperature. I can't see what their actual temperatures were. They're based, because that's the other thing with femtech. A lot of it is not only taking your temperature from a different place, but then also creating your chart based on like an average of temperatures and making it this like beautiful looking chart that may not be reality. And so we can't actually see what's happening because these algorithms are not designed to help us identify problems. It's just to identify ovulation. And so I'm more than happy for people to go ahead and use those if they want, but just know that there are risks. It could be wrong. It could be saying your predicted fertile window is this, but then if something stressful happens in your life and that changes or whatever, how's the algorithm supposed to know? So it's really important that if you're going to use those algorithms, you use those as a tool, but you also understand what's happening and know that like, okay, it's predicting my fertile window at this phase because that's what life's been like. That's what my last 6 cycles have been like. But I just moved house and went on vacation and got like diarrhea. And ovulation is like potentially delayed and I need to be, conscious of that. So that's my take. I don't hate them at all. I love temp drop as an option, especially when I was postpartum and I just like couldn't get 5 consecutive hours of sleep to get a reliable basal body temperature. I think it's all really helpful. Just know too that when you are unable to do the fertility awareness method to full efficacy following all the rules and you have to go to a, a femtech piece, or you have to, you know, skip a lot of temperatures or just rely on mucus, you just add barriers of protection, right? So you just start adding condoms, or you just start avoiding unprotected sex in the fertile window at all until you have confirmed ovulation. Just to, you know, be smart about things.
Yeah. Extra safety. I understand.
Mm.
Okay. Okay. And then most of these like algorithms, they kind of classify things as like green and red days, right? Of like green being that if you're using them for
Mm.
contraceptive purposes, green being that this is where you aren't going to get pregnant, and then red being the opposite. If you're using it for fertility purposes, it would obviously be the opposite. But from just a
Yeah.
contraceptive perspective, can you tell us what do we roughly expect the green days to be of when a woman's not fertile, and then when would a woman roughly expect their red days to be of when they should be extra safe?
Yeah. And like roughly expect is so true. It is possible to ovulate and get pregnant on your period if things are wild enough under the hood there for you. Okay. So, in general, we say on a dry day, right? So, you are seeing no cervical mucus. When you wipe, it is dry. that is, generally speaking, a safe day. And then there are some additional things to note, right? So, like, once you get into the fertile window, you might see mucus, then you won't see it for 2 days. And so there are rules to follow there. But to be super general, if it's dry, it's safe to have sex without risking pregnancy. Once you have confirmed ovulation, it's definitely safe, right? So, like, that's kind of my go to when I'm unsure. I will actually abstain from unprotected sex until I'm 100% certain that I have confirmed ovulation, and it's really dry. So, after ovulation and before your first day of your bleed, you know, go for gold.
Yeah. And can you tell us what the day of the cycle would look like roughly? So if day one is like the first day you start your period, when would someone expect that they're going to start to notice the cervical mucus production?
Yeah, I mean, so you could notice it as soon as a day or two after you finish bleeding. It really is common to see it around day 6, all the way, typically textbook style, basically between then in the lead up to day 14 of ovulation. So I always feel like I just finished my period and it's already my fertile window. I was like, "Ooh," like it comes up real fast. So honestly, especially like the more rested you are, the more fed you are, the sooner that phase is going to come. That really is a big piece. So if I've been on vacation, or if it was Thanksgiving and Christmas and I've added a few pounds of weight and everything, I notice that fertile window tends to happen sooner, and I start seeing mucus day 6, 7. But if I'm playing pickleball 3 times a day and just like working all the time and pushing my body a lot, I tend to notice it will delay itself up to 9, 10, 11. So it's definitely worth keeping an eye on, but yeah, you could expect it very, very shortly after you finish your bleed.
Yeah, and that's I think one of the reasons why just talking about like during your period, it's not always safe to have unprotected sex if you're trying to use this for contraceptive purposes, right? Because if you do
Yeah.
start to get that cervical mucus production like the next day, then you technically are in an environment where, like you said, that sperm can get nourished and it can take.
Whoops.
Yep.
Exactly. And it's obviously very difficult to observe mucus while bleeding. So
Yeah.
I personally don't take that risk, because there has been an instance, and it was years ago for me, but it has been an instance where I ovulated on day 6.
Interesting.
And when that happened, I was just like, "Yep, yeah, nope." I mean, progesterone wasn't high enough. I didn't get pregnant, but I mean, it can happen, and it does happen. So it's just definitely something to be aware of.
Yeah, cool. This is great to understand for women. Thank you. What about on the opposite end of the spectrum for fertility? I know that this will obviously depend on when someone's ovulation time period is happening, but could you just tell us around that ovulation, when are the best days to conceive? Is it when the cervical mucus production initially begins? Is it once it's changed consistency? What's a woman looking for?
You know, if you see mucus, you are fertile. Like, I don't care what mucus you're seeing. Like, truthfully, that's one way to look at it. I don't care what you're seeing. I mean, my business partner, Ashley, she saw just, she did not have any intention of getting pregnant. She was team no kids. And she saw just this little tiny bit of like sticky white mucus. And she was like, far away enough. No,
Didn't work.
she got pregnant. She got pregnant. So I like you. I almost don't even subscribe to the belief that there's a better day. But when you start to see that transition from creamy, tacky, sticky over to stretchy, crystal clear, you're just very close to ovulation. Definitely not a bad time. Definitely not a bad time to time for conception.
Cool. Okay. So cervical mucus, if you're trying to get pregnant, that's the time frame that the sperm love.
Yeah. Yep. 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 Yep.
Okay.
And then you learn yourself too. Like, you kind of get used to noticing my mucus phase is like always 7 days. I'm gonna give it 2 more days. You might do that, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, awesome. And then if someone is currently on birth control and they're interested in fertility awareness method, they've heard about it, but they're just really afraid. They're like, I don't know if I can do all 10 rules really well and make sure I nail them down, where do you feel like is the best place to start? Would you recommend they start getting comfortable with some of these methods like before they even come off birth control, or do you have any better recommendations?
Oh yeah. I mean, this is just my opinion, and I want absolutely everyone. All we want is people to have this education and then do what's right and best for them. Um, but I'm always just team come off the come off the birth control, and we're gonna figure this out as we go. So if you want to come off birth control but you do not want to get pregnant, you know, great. Your choice is to immediately start learning about it. You can learn a heck of a lot very, very quickly. You could get by the end of the week and know everything you need to know, truthfully. Come off that birth control and just be smart about your sexual choices for the first while you learn this information and get going. Because until you come off the birth control, your cycle is being impacted by the birth control. So, like, you need to come off it at some point in order to start the method, in order to begin using it. So, I'm just team come off it right now, right? Let's agree to abstain or be extra safe while we learn this. And it won't be long before you're very confident in what you're doing. It just kind of takes a leap of faith.
And do you find that in some women, it can take several months for them to start seeing the cervical mucus production and start seeing these temperature changes with their BBT data after they've come off an oral contraceptive?
I actually do not see it take that long, where it's more like a 4 to 6 week time frame, and then we're really starting to see what the body is doing without exogenous hormones impacting it. So it's good that to start taking those metrics ASAP, because it's fascinating to see the difference, right? When we have people come off fertility treatments or birth control, often when they're working with us, and we get them to start right away, because it's also empowering to watch what happens when your temperatures go from being crazy, erratic, all over the place, not making any sense, to getting more into the natural rhythm and looking more like what you've been hearing about and reading about in the textbooks. And that empowers you and it excites us, because we're like, wow, yeah, this is showing me a window into what's really happening. It's not just some crunchy lady on a podcast saying it, it's real. And I
Mhm.
think that that's really beneficial. So I have no, sometimes people be like, I haven't bothered starting charting because I'm still on these fertility drugs or whatever. I'm like, nah, let's just do it. Like, let's do it and let's see what happens, because it will be really interesting. So we find about 4 to 6 weeks. If you're missing menstrual cycle, if you think it's post pill amenorrhea, if you don't have any signs of your cycle coming back after 6 weeks, you're not looking at post pill amenorrhea, in my opinion. You're looking at amenorrhea.
Mhm. Yeah, hypothalamic amenorrhea. Okay, awesome. Well, this is super helpful. What's your favorite thing about fertility awareness method that you've learned or observed in yourself or in clients you've worked with over the years?
Oh, I mean, just the whole way that everyone comes in with a little bit of doubt that this is as cool as it really is. And then you start going about your life, living your life, and seeing how every day your temperature and your mucus and stuff is like reflective of real life, and zooming out on a month. And we've been able to solve problems for people by like saying, okay, this cycle is weird. Let's go back 3 months when you had a beautiful cycle. Talk to me about that. What was going on in your life? And we uncover facts and things like with the chart. By far and away, my favorite thing is that with the chart, it removes emotion and fear. So, oh, I'm just like not sure if this is working, or I feel like it's not working, blah, 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 blah. Or I feel like I'm eating enough, or I feel like I'm resting enough. It removes, I don't care what you feel. Here's the chart. All right. Like, here's the facts. So let's look at this. Let's understand why it looks the way it is and make actual changes. Because in this work is so emotional, with women, fertility, weight gain, rest, it's riddled with fear. So when we have this tool, we can start to be more objective and base all of our decisions on facts. And that moves us towards our fertility goal very quickly, because it's much less emotional. That has to be my favorite part.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm big. using data person as well, because I think that so much of like health information can be so subjective at times. And that, that's why it can be so confusing, because everything is context dependent, right? It always depends. Like, yeah, do that in the follicular phase, but it depends on what you should do in the luteal phase, right? So I agree. Having this data just really helps to be able to take that subjectiveness out of it and really get to the personalization of what's your own individual body's needs. And I want to just, before we get done, kind of touch on like your thoughts around cycle syncing, because I think that's something that's really kind of become more popular recently. And I think that a lot of women that have these irregular cycles, maybe what they're seeing on the cycle syncing data isn't actually what they're seeing in their own cycle. Can you tell us what you're seeing with some of this information?
Yeah. And are you kind of referring to like where how people sort of design their lives and
Yeah.
exercise and things around it? Yeah.
Mhm.
It's so funny that like people would say charting seems like hard work. I thought doing that seems like really hard work to me. Like organizing my life around it, but I can see how certain personalities would like love that kind of thing. But not my personality. I feel that, as a working mom and business owner, um, yeah, more I just got to do what I got to do. But what I do appreciate a lot about the concept of cycle syncing is really just like the awareness of where you're at in your cycle so that you can have more reasonable expectations around your ability. So I generally don't change my training or my schedule based on my cycle. But if I'm training and I'm feeling tired or I'm having a hard session, uh, I understand why. Whereas once upon a time, I would have beat myself up and been like, well, I did really well last week and now I suck and I'm only as good as my last workout or whatever, um, as an athlete. But then realizing, no, I just was in a totally different phase of my cycle. And so I just expect that piece is really beneficial because it quiets the voice in my mind. So that that's really where it sticks in for me. And then, we have a team. We're all female on our team, and we can't help but notice who has the big audacious ideas and who is the most productive and who busted out like some huge project in just a couple of days. We know we're always like, were you ovulating? Are you ovulating? Because this idea is like a really big, audacious idea. And I have a feeling you might be overcommitting. And so let's like wait till next week and see how you feel before we decide to act on to act on
Puts
that
you at the
idea.
low
Like
spot.
definitely. Yeah. I honestly like our whole business, if you kind of like went through everything and you looked at like our lead generators and our podcasts and our blogs and our YouTubes, like they were probably all done around ovulation for me. And I just do a ton of them at once. And then I'm like, I hate all of those things. I never want to make content again. And then so on.
I hear you. That's awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about what you're doing over at the HA Society and how you can help women that are wanting to understand fertility awareness method more.
Yeah. So I also want to share someone else, not necessarily just us. So Lisa Hendricks and Jack of Fertility Friday, for someone who's really just trying to learn about their own body, who has a regular cycle, maybe they're just trying to get pregnant, they want to learn all of this. She's my go to send people to. So that was Fertility Friday, and she has her own podcast. She has courses. She's the author of The Fifth Vital Sign. She has a certification. She's just really great for that. But over at the HA Society, we're solving pretty big menstrual cycle problems. People who have low hormone function, specifically, they're almost missing their whole cycle, if not, they're entirely missing their menstrual cycle. A handful of people with premature ovarian insufficiency. So wherever they're using their menstrual cycle as a tool to solve problems, not necessarily just help you time for pregnancy. So if you are kind of listening and you're like, I don't have a menstrual cycle, or my cycles are like 6 months apart, or they're really light and they used to not be, and you know, we're your go-to for that for sure. So we have a community, we have coaching, we have group coaching, and I have a podcast. And I think that that's just a really great place to start because you'll start to kind of hear experiences and stories and connect the dots if this sounds like you or not. And a lot of people just get a ton of clarity from taking that route. So that's the Hypothalamic Amenorrhea podcast. I think that that would be a great place to start.
Wonderful. Yeah. Lisa is a great resource and yeah, she's got tons of information. Her book, The Fifth Vital Sign, is great. So thank you for plugging that for her as well. Much appreciated. But I appreciate your time so much today. And thank you for all that you're doing to help women and all the education that you shared with us. And we really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you for having me.